Good day. My name is Mark Smith, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to open this very important program. I'm the co-director of the Southwestern Institute for International and Comparative Law, which is a division of the Center for American and International Law. This is a new series for us, and we're grateful to have you with us. Let me begin by saying, after World War II, some 80 years or so ago, Robert Storey, an American lawyer, served as executive trial counsel at Nuremberg. He then returned home to Texas, and he had an understanding that a peaceful world, a world in which justice prevails, depends upon the rule of law. With that vision in mind, he founded what is now known as the Center for American and International Law, CAIL, as we call it. And that's the organization that is hosting this program. For almost 75 years, CAIL has been committed to professional education, to the rule of law, and to the notion that people of goodwill can make a difference in the world. Over the years, we've had participants from some 130 countries, and we have many countries represented today. To commemorate Dean Storey's legacy, we are today, with this program, launching a new program, a new series, the Dean Robert G. Storey Rule of Law Lecture Series. In this first year, there will be 6 programs, and each one will focus on rule of law issues affecting a particular region of the world. Today's program concerns promises and challenges concerning the rule of law in the Middle East, and we're presenting it from an American perspective. Our presenter is one of our own trustees, Robert Jordan, who is a former United States ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He will be interviewed by another CAIL trustee, Susan Karamanian, who is Dean of the College of Law at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Dean Karamanian also chairs the advisory board of our Southwestern Institute for International and Comparative Law. And for the next hour, you'll be in the good hands of Ambassador Jordan and Dean Karamanian, and on behalf of CAIL, on behalf of those of us who have the good fortune of helping to put this program together, we send our thanks to Ambassador Jordan, to Dean Karamanian, and to all of you who are with us today. Susan, we're in your very good hands.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. And let me join Mark in welcoming Ambassador Jordan and our audience to the first Dean Robert G. Storey Rule of Law lecture. As Mark indicated, this is sponsored by the Southwestern Institute of International and Comparative Law, all part of the Center for American and International Law. Key to fulfilling Dean Storey's vision was what he described as, and in quotes, person-to-person contact between leaders of the legal profession. He also emphasized that it would be, quote, for the mutual understanding of difficult questions of fact and in defining legal arrangements to solve a problem, end quote. While we're not in person, we are able to meet via this medium to have a conversation about the promotion of the rule of law in a specific region of the world in particular. And we have attendees from around the world. And particularly we have an audience from the Middle East where I am now. So a big welcome to all of you. And today we're fortunate to have with us for the inaugural Storey event, a man who's devoted his entire professional career to helping promote the rule of law, whether it be in the United States or abroad, particularly in the Middle East, Ambassador Robert Jordan. Ambassador Jordan is diplomat in residence and professor of practice in the John G. Tower Center for Political Studies at the Southern Methodist University. He was the United States ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2001 to 2003. He was a partner in the international law firm of Baker Botts LLP for many years, and he had the firm's Middle East practice in Dubai until his retirement from the firm in 2014. He is vice chair of the Tower Center Board of Directors and the World Affairs Council of Dallas, Fort Worth, and a member of the Board of Governors of the Middle East Institute and the Southwestern Medical Foundation. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a past president of the Dallas Bar Association. As Mark indicated, he's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Center for American International Law, and he's on the board of the Tate Lecture Series at Southern Methodist University. He serves on the the advisory board of the bilateral U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce, and he's a frequent commentator on international media programs, including CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, CNBC, Bloomberg, and the New York Times. I'm sure some of you have already read his memoir, Desert Diplomat, Inside Saudi Arabia Following 9/11, which was published by Potomac Books. And if you've had the chance to read it, I'm sure one of the reasons you're here today is to get additional insights into what was a very important time for diplomacy in the region, the development of the rule of law in the region. So Ambassador Jordan, welcome. It's a delight to see you. Before we get into a lot of the detailed substantive questions, I think it'd be good for the audience to get a little perspective about you personally. Just something about your background on becoming an ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And this was, as many may know, but now if the audience doesn't know, this was shortly after September 11th, and a very challenging time for the kingdom and of course for the United States as well. So just if we could launch with that, and then we're going to then look into some of the rule of law questions.
Sure. Well, I was, as the bio indicated, not a career diplomat. I was, as I put it, an innocent lawyer minding my own business in Dallas, Texas, when my friend, the President of the United States, asked me to be ambassador to Saudi Arabia. It had evolved over a period of years. I had represented George W. Bush in a securities matter in the early 90s. He then became governor of Texas. We stayed friends. And so when he was elected president, he asked me to serve in his administration. We initially thought that I might serve in the Justice Department, but quite clearly the new Attorney General, John Ashcroft, wanted his own people in there. And so ultimately in the spring of 2001, the president asked me to be ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Well, I initially thought this was about the worst idea I had ever heard. I didn't know much about Saudi Arabia, but I had read the stereotypes of a very repressive environment, intolerant, very hot climate, poor record on human rights, women's rights, and religious freedom. So I pondered the request for a while. And one evening in about April, I was home and my son was home from college, and he turned to me and he said, "You know, Dad, when your friend, the President of the United States, asks you to serve your country, you really can't say no, can you?" And I said, "That's right, Peter. I have decided that I'm going to take the job." And so I spent the summer of 2001 going back and forth to Washington, meeting with think tanks, dealing with the government, trying to learn about being an ambassador, and certainly learn about Saudi Arabia. Now, why would someone like me go to Saudi Arabia? Well, the Saudis, of course, have to give diplomatic credentials to any ambassador who is assigned to that country. This is what's called agrément. And the Saudis refused to give agrément to a career foreign service officer as the ambassador. They wanted someone who was a friend of the president, who could go over the heads of the bureaucracy, and who didn't have a career to protect. And so that was me. And so we were thinking that perhaps I would arrive sometime in early 2002. But as we know, the events of 9/11 really sped that up. And so the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which had to confirm me in my nomination was someone named Joe Biden. And Senator Biden agreed to give me a prompt hearing. And so my hearing occurred in early October of 2001. And about 2 days later, I found myself in Riyadh. So it was a process, an important process, but it also reflects, I think, how countries like America operate within a rule of law, operate with procedures, and everyone on both sides and in both parties has confidence in those procedures.
So you arrive in Riyadh, and you're in a region of the world that has a very strong legal tradition, whether it be through the Egyptian civil code or through legal systems from other systems from abroad, as well as in Sharia too. And you were ambassador, and then also you worked in Dubai, heading the Baker Botts office there and the like. And you mentioned earlier some comments just about concerns about going to Saudi because of human rights issues and women's issues and related issues and the like. So you've been able to see transformation in the region, particularly as to the rule of law, from, I think, a unique perspective. What are some of the positive developments in this respect?
Well, one of my concerns when I arrived in Saudi Arabia was to deal with what I saw as extremism, intolerance, and an unwillingness to be part of the international community. And so I suggested to the White House, to the president, that getting the Saudis into the World Trade Organization, the WTO, would be a means of enforcing adherence to the rule of law, adherence to international commercial norms. And in order to qualify for membership in the WTO, the Saudis would have to completely revise much of their commercial legislation. They would have to have an insurance code, for example. They would have to have a commercial code, and these would be required in order to qualify for membership. I received support from the White House, and so I launched an initiative with the Saudis to encourage them to go through a fairly difficult process in order to qualify for membership. I got some pushback, of course, from certain members of the Saudi government, even though Crown Prince Abdullah, who was running the country, was very supportive. But under him, there were a number of bureaucrats who were not. One of them was the Minister of Commerce at the time, and I went to the Crown Prince at one point and said, I can't work with this guy. He is not adhering to what you have directed. And so that minister was fired, and the person who had actually been the head of the Jeddah Chamber of Commerce was brought in as the new Minister of Commerce, Abdullah Al-Reza. Abdullah was a tremendous ally in helping us get over the line, and by 2005, the Saudis were in. They are now part of the G20. They have a much more regularized system of commerce, a much more reliable set of rules. And I have been gratified to see that last month, the current government has announced that they're going to be codifying their laws even further, including some elements of their personal status laws, which have been governed by a very amorphous and opaque Sharia system up to this point. So that, I think, is one very strong encouraging factor. I would also say that the development of commercial courts in countries like the UAE and Qatar are encouraging as well. The impetus for achieving an atmosphere of rule of law in many countries is the importance of foreign direct investment, of development of an economy, of diversification of an economy. And so that operates in a market sense as a tremendous incentive for those governments to regularize many of their laws in that regard.
It's fascinating how when you first focused, it was on an international institution, and the standards set out in that institution, the WTO as being a driver then for domestic reform. And then secondly, the extent to which foreign investment is also driving the reform, the need for the investors from abroad to have some sense of comfort, both as to understanding legal norms and confidence in the system for adjudicating disputes, hence the rise of the Dubai International Financial Center, the Abu Dhabi Capital Market, and of course the Qatar Financial Center here, which takes largely a foreign law, common law approach. The parties are free to select the law for their disputes, and of course the courts that are there. We'll explore that a little bit more later. What in terms of concerns do you have as to the rule of law in the region?
Well, there are many. Many of these positive points also have another side of the coin. So, for example, the new Saudi codification of their laws is still quite amorphous. They haven't really explained exactly what it's going to look like. And it's one thing to say that it's important to have a rule of law, but the question is which laws? And so if the Saudis proceed simply to codify repressive laws that discriminate, laws that enhance authority without accountability, and that subject the populations to capricious prosecution or surveillance, then I think we've got a problem. And so it remains to be seen whether there truly will be laws that develop freedom, that develop transparency and accountability. I'm also concerned that in some ways, the Arab Spring did not bring a breath of fresh air. It was really not a spring in many ways, but instead a winter. Aspirations of populations were not met. And I think increased surveillance, increased repression, increased prosecution of dissidents pretty much across the region is still an issue that I think we have to be concerned about. There is a lack of accountability, as I said, and we're also seeing what I would call these less majeste laws enacted. I think Thailand is probably a poster child for these laws. You can't say anything negative about the king or the government, but we're also seeing this in a number of countries in the Middle East. And we're also seeing further a definition of corruption that in some laws that is so broad that about anyone can be guilty of it. We're seeing even back in 2014 under King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, laws that made it a crime to say anything negative about the royal family or the government. So some of this repression, I think, may continue. And if we simply look at the codification of these laws, I think that's going to be a real problem. There's also obviously an economic element here that is leading to tremendous risk of poverty, joblessness, lack of education in many countries. There is a youth bulge in many countries that is going to have to be addressed, and a failing economy is likely to lead to much more dissent, conflict, and perhaps repression. And many of the Gulf states have been able to avoid that up to this point by heavily subsidizing their populations. If those subsidies fail or recede, then we may start seeing a greater reluctance to follow authority and perhaps greater repression.
In that regard, then, and thank you also for touching on, I think, some of the factors that are driving what could see impediments and the like. Part of what CAIL has done brilliantly over the years and through the Academy in particular is to bring lawyers together and to learn about specific legal standards and the like. And we know that lawyers in the United States, where you and I are licensed and practice, have been at the forefront of helping to build the United States democracy and in promoting the rule of law. And I think we would all agree that it is a difficult undertaking. There always will be challenges, whether it be the challenges you just described in the Middle East or the challenges that we face in the United States. We've seen the lawyers in the region play important roles, but others really, at times I think there is a fear of can they be the advocates for reforms, and particularly in some of the states where they could face arrests and the like. What are your thoughts on this topic, the role of the lawyer in the Middle East, and can they help fulfill the dream of what Dean Storey has described in being leaders of reform?
Well, there's a famous line in one of William Shakespeare's plays, which says, "First thing we do before we start our revolution is kill all the lawyers." And that doesn't mean lawyers are evil. It actually means they are protectors of the system. They're the ones who adhere to the rule of law, who try to head off revolutions, who try to make things more regular, more predictable, and more transparent. And so I do think there is a special role for lawyers. Many of us in our jurisdictions take an oath to support the rule of law. And I think lawyers around the world need to remember that sort of duty. It's a duty that transcends many cultures. And so what do? Well, there is a risk, of course. In many countries, freedom of assembly is not permitted. But lawyers talk with each other. It's a pretty social bunch, generally speaking. And lawyers get to know each other. And I think a lot of the informal talk and conversation is important. I can recall when I was ambassador, I would meet with various groups of people, many business groups, many individuals. I would meet in their homes. We would have dinner. Perhaps there were 20 of us sitting around a majlis, just talking about the future, the government, roles that people might play. And I think informal conversations like this are opportunities to educate colleagues, to educate fellow lawyers, and then members of the public on the facts of situations without necessarily having to be hysterical about it or hyperbolic, but instead making sure the facts of the issues are understood. Dealing with the media. There are great opportunities to deal with the media. And civil society does exist in many countries that are still struggling to fully embrace the rule of law. The chambers of commerce in many countries are actually extremely powerful. The boards of directors are opportunities for lawyers and others to participate. I think it would be a tragedy if lawyers in evolving countries like this miss the opportunity to participate to the extent they're allowed, and then over time, it's a long game, over time, more and more influence can be felt. Participate in the politics of your country, participate in leadership opportunities, run for office if running for office is permitted. Get to know the leadership of the country, get to know the members of the media and the press in your country. There are many things that can be done, and it is a challenge sometimes, and sometimes it takes a great deal of courage. But I think that's the way lawyers in our profession are geared to work and have, in some ways, an obligation to work.
It reminds me, when I talk to people from around the world about their own legal systems and the role of lawyers working informally. It goes back to Anthony Croman's book on the lawyer statesman too. You can be a lawyer statesman in your community, not at the ambassador level, but in your community. And a lot of it is about educating. The important responsibility of a lawyer to educate the public, and particularly in the Middle East through the mashless system, way in which conversations could affect reform. And I think it's also the media is critical, and how to best use the media to convey a message. It's not something that I think intuitively would come to a lawyer, but somebody who's skilled in understanding the best way to convey a message, I think would be able to affect a certain degree of change. Do you think that that for lawyers themselves, is there, you were talking about like within a country. What about throughout the region in general? We have lawyers here from the region in the audience. Do you think working collectively, talking collectively would be of great value? And that does tend to play in another question I have, and you alluded to this earlier, and that is the differences in the region, the economic differences in particular with the Gulf states and a lot of resources, and then of course other states that have had to deal with war or other economic difficulties.
Sure. Well, first of all, in communication around the region, participating in events like this very one we're in right now, participating in regional conferences, participating in events sponsored by nonprofit organizations. The World Bank, for example, is a very powerful institution that has a lot of leverage and influence with many countries. They have programs, they have analyses of the extent of rule of law in countries. There are many other organizations like that. International arbitration is another way that across country lines, communication can develop and confidence in institutions can be created. Back on your point about economic differences in countries, I'm not sure that the wealth of a country, particularly in the Middle East based on oil, is necessarily an indication that they're going to have a stronger commitment to the rule of law. In some ways, it might operate in the opposite direction. Many of these are rentier states in which, as I said earlier, populations are subsidized. They don't pay taxes, and in exchange for that, they don't have a voice in their government. And so in those countries, we're actually seeing a fair amount of authoritarian conduct. For example, we see Shura councils in a number of countries, but they really have very little influence. They're advisory and they're useful, and they're perhaps a stepping stone to further development of civil society. But they're certainly not evidence of true democracy in that sense. And I think there's an argument that can be made and is being made in many of these states that democracy is not exactly what we're after there. I think you'll hear from them that instead they're after freedom of association, freedom of press. But if it comes in the form of a monarchy, for example, that's okay. On the other hand, you'll see countries that purport to be democracies have elections, and then they continue to perform as autocracies with very little freedom for the population. So the wealth of the country is not an indication, but it does show that they have the resources, at least, to develop international standards and norms. And this, again, I think is where a market economy comes in. If they have an interest in foreign direct investment, as most countries do, we're seeing time and again now that the players on the international scene do not want to come into a country that cannot guarantee the sanctity of their contracts, that can't provide a predictable result, and that is so rife with corruption that the whims of an individual bureaucrat can overwhelm what even the written law says.
That observation plays into a question from the audience that we have here, and that is that you just described how foreign investment can drive the rule of law as to the protection of the investment or foreign companies. But what about beyond that? What about human rights, civil rights, children's rights, and the like?
That is a much more difficult area. And I think we're seeing this, and even in some of these wealthy countries. When I was living in Dubai, they were building the Burj Khalifa, and they had many workers' actions, many accidents, many protests over the way in which workers were being treated in the construction of that building. That's just one example. We are now seeing some revisions. For example, in Saudi Arabia, the promised revision is to some elements of workers' rights in the kingdom, and certain sponsorship elements are being revised for guest workers, even though it doesn't yet appear to apply to domestic workers. So again, it's a slow process. It's maddeningly slow. This is where international transparency can come into play. I spent a great deal of time with the Saudis urging them to adopt more tolerant domestic roles, working on the guardianship system for women, for example, allowing women to travel more and ultimately to drive. Crown Prince Abdullah told me in 2003 that he was going to start allowing women to run for city council positions the next year. Well, it turns out that didn't actually happen until about 2015. And so even though there is a promise of some progress in these areas, there's often very little change, at least on the short term.
These observations then play into the second question from the audience, and we're getting a lot of questions from the audience, Bob. But I think they're right up your alley, and your comments are I imagine getting a lot of people's brains thinking. And this is with regard to Saudi specifically and Wahhabism. What are your thoughts about the relationship between the rule of law and Wahhabism, the conservative view of Islam that predominates in Saudi Arabia?
The attitudes within Saudi Arabia governed by their particular version of Islam have traditionally given a tremendous amount of power to Sharia judges, for example, if you're talking about the rule of law. Sharia has very little written precedential value. Each judge is empowered to make his decisions based on his view. And the view is informed, according to at least the reports that I've seen, is informed by the view of what God would want, as opposed to anything that is directed by man. And so there has been resistance by at least the religious establishment to codified norms, to civil law, to adoption of non-Sharia forms of enforcement or dispute resolution. And the Saudis have struggled with this. I think King Abdullah in 2007, 2009 kept announcing that they were going to start codifying their laws, and he encountered tremendous resistance to that. We're now seeing, as of last month, some additional move in that regard, and there may be some progress. We do hear comments that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is advocating what he would call a more moderate form of Islam, a more traditional view of the Wahhabi approach going back to the 18th century. I'm not sure how accurate the theology of all that is, but if there is an effort to modify some of the intolerance and extremism that we've seen, then that's a good thing, and it may dovetail with a greater recognition of normative standards for the legal administration of law and justice.
In that vein as well, we have an observation from somebody who was an Aramco brat, the person says, and has always had difficulty trying to explain her childhood and the dichotomy and the like. And she asks, are we at a point of growing pains as they are trying to adjust to the Western culture and values with the traditional, or is there something more going on here? Is it I guess not so much growing pains? Is it I guess the other option would be is that this is just window dressing and nothing really will ever happen, and this plays into another question that has been asked, and just in terms of timing on all these issues. How long will it take if it's going to play out for it to play out?
One of my predecessors as ambassador of Saudi Arabia back in the 1990s was a fellow named Chaz Freeman. And Chaz has always said that Saudi Arabia is characterized by progress without change. I think that is actually changing somewhat now. I think the notion of Vision 2030, the notion of women driving, of having futuristic cities, of having a diversified economy where jobs are created is an incentive, and it's real. The question in my mind is it too ambitious, and how do you pay for it, given the uncertainty of the price of oil and given the uncertainty of foreign direct investment? But I think there is a clear effort being made, and I think it also is partly an explanation for why King Salman chose this particular son as his crown prince. He wanted someone who could be more in the model of Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, or Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, someone who could individually make hard decisions, perhaps even ruthless decisions, in the process of transforming the country. I certainly don't agree with every measure this crown prince has taken, but I think that's part of the equation now, which makes it more likely that some of these pronouncements and statements are at least a little bit more than window dressing, even if in some cases they're also a means of consolidating power.
Great. There's another question that came in, and I'm intrigued by it because I think there's an assumption in it that perhaps you would disagree with. At least I would disagree a little bit with it, just knowing a bit about what's going on in the region. But that was, will we see the civil code system emerge alongside religious courts? Or will we have some more like multicultural division, religious and cultural lines like the old Ottoman Empire? And the reason I sort of question the assumption is that we already see, I know in Qatar we have these the civil code and it's being practiced in our courts, inherited largely from Egypt and the like.
Yeah. I think in some ways, some of the countries in the region are different from the others. For example, most of the Gulf monarchies, other than Saudi Arabia, were British protectorates until 1971. And a British system of law was heavily involved at that point, with some overlay, again, from the Egyptian civil code and even sort of cherry picking other countries' histories and legal systems as well. The Saudis, on the other hand, were never occupied by a Western power. And so they never had a tradition really of anything other than Sharia. Their constitution is the Quran. And so there are traditions in Saudi Arabia that have really not embraced the notion of a civil code to the extent that we've seen in some of the other countries. And so I think you've got to almost look country by country to see what their histories and traditions have been. And I think it's an important point. The Professor Nathan Brown, who you may have known at George Washington,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
has written about this. And I would encourage people to read some of his writings. But his point is that in many of these countries that have adopted civil codes, it isn't because they were imposed on them, it is because they selected them as being useful choices for developing their legal systems as they evolved. And so I think we are likely to still see the resilience of civil codes. I doubt that we're ever going to see a complete merger, for example, of the DIFC courts in Dubai with other judicial systems, even in the UAE. They will remain separate, but there is an effort, I think, to harmonize the approach among them. And lawyers are increasingly interested in learning more about the systems in which they don't practice. They will often have to associate someone who practices in that arena in order to engage in a lawsuit, for example. But there's a lot of cross-pollination going on there, which I think is quite useful and productive, and another way for lawyers to communicate with each other.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I know that the Dubai Financial Center, the Abu Dhabi Global Market, the Qatar Financial Center, they all have MOUs as well with perhaps local institutions in the countries, as well as institutions around the world, talking to each other and the like. One topic we haven't even addressed yet, but it has come in through a question, and I think I would imagine this is a question that is at the front of a number of the minds of our viewers today, is the role of extremist groups in the region, and concerns that perhaps there could be some uptick again. As one of the questioners says, they are the most important enemy of the rule of law. They do not believe in the law. What are your thoughts about the role of the international community in attempting to address this issue?
Well, it continues to be a real threat, but part of the problem is in defining who or what is an extremist group. So, for example, in the UAE, they would say the Muslim Brotherhood is an extremist group. It needs to be marginalized, it needs to have extreme surveillance, and needs to have no participation in the society. On the other hand, in Egypt, until the current regime came in, under Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood was totally accepted as a legitimate part of the environment. Likewise, in Lebanon, one of the largest participants there is Hezbollah. In many other countries, Hezbollah would be considered a terrorist group. And so part of it is trying to define groups that are consistent with maintaining norms, maintaining a commitment to regularized transparency, government accountability, and certainly rejecting violence. It is still a problem. You see in Turkey also, by the way, a tremendous disparity between what perhaps we would consider to be normative behavior and as opposed to counterproductive antisocial behavior. And so it's a problem. And it requires, I think, international commitment to assisting in countering extremist ideologies, extremist tactics, and certainly threats of violence. But it also requires a certain amount of restraint on the part of the governments to not use as an excuse the presence of these forces to overwhelm a population, to engage in diminishing the freedoms that most of their citizens should have.
It's interesting that you mentioned the international engagement. I think one of the important areas is education, and education to eradicate the extremists, and the role that, for example, Education Above All here, which is part of Sheikh Moza's initiative, has been focused on this very issue, working with the United Nations, seeing the way education could be a way to address these form of extremism. A couple of questions are coming up now in terms of the region itself and foreign foreign influence. In the region, there's always been foreign influence here, and the role of trading historically, but also during the colonial times and the like. And the Chinese government is very active in the region as well. What are your thoughts on that, and also the rule of law? I'm curious about their engagement in the kingdom. I haven't followed that but that was sort of a follow-on question I had to this question from one of the members of the audience.
Now, China is really upping its game in much of the Middle East, and certainly in Saudi Arabia. They're building a transcontinental railway, which is probably the greatest, one of the greatest infrastructure projects they have going on right now. China is a mercantilist society, and so when they come into a country with what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, they often help develop infrastructure, usually by bringing in thousands and thousands of Chinese workers to actually do the work, as opposed to providing jobs for the local population. You'll see governments becoming heavily indebted to China through loans to develop these projects, and then in some cases being unable to perform on those loans. This gives the Chinese leverage. It gives them an opportunity to foreclose or take over some of the ownership rights in these systems. The Chinese do not care about the rule of law, but they do care about stability. And so they want stability of governments. They are not in any way interested in revolutions or popular uprisings. Even some of the more admirable parts of the Arab Spring protests would not have been attractive to the Chinese. And so you have an entity that wants to extract from each of these countries whatever it can economically, but is not much interested in investing back in the countries or certainly developing any of their institutions.
If we could go back to more of the role of the financial centers and the like, we have these zones that have foreign law with foreign judges, and there is some cooperation with the host cities and host states and the like. But what are your thoughts on this development in terms of the rule of law? Does it mean that we're going to have really these multiple legal systems? Does it mean that there would be perhaps a disengagement from some of the local courts? Are we better spending the resources working with the local courts and as opposed to saying we're just going to create something new?
Well, I think you can actually have it both ways. And in some ways, you have to have it both ways if you want to attract foreign direct investment, if you want to attract an international population, international investment. It is certainly desirable to not have stovepipes in components of your legal systems throughout any jurisdiction. But at the same time, given the cultural norms that have to be respected, I don't think we're likely to see Sharia courts, for example, completely abandoned. That the long-standing norms that have governed many elements of the adherence to Sharia. At the same time, and likewise in some of the civil law and civil code elements of the systems. But the reality of it is that from an economic standpoint, in order to have the kind of progress and the kind of economic improvement that we want to see in so many jurisdictions, you've got to have a mechanism to attract those who are somewhat intimidated perhaps by the other legal systems and also are contributing a lot to those societies. So the non DIFC, the non-specialized courts, in many ways can attract investment that then spills over into the rest of the country and the rest of society in a way that builds that and builds confidence. And again, as I was talking earlier, it's an important element to harmonize these systems as opposed to stovepiping them or having one overwhelm the other. So I don't think it's an either or situation, but I think it's a mutual commitment to developing the quality of the systems, the quality of the judges, the quality of the lawyers, and as you put it earlier, the education that's involved in all of that through each of these systems. Even in the United States, we have a very robust arbitration regime and many arbitration organizations. It doesn't mean that necessarily that is to the detriment of the civil or criminal court systems that exist in all of our states.
Right, and that observation plays into a question that has been asked about the kingdom and its ratification of the New York Convention on the recognition and enforcement of foreign arbitral awards. Yeah. Are the courts in Saudi enforcing arbitration agreements and arbitration awards? They
say they do, but historically they have not.
Yeah, it takes time for the courts to really understand and to work through these issues. And you've seen it in a number of countries. Even if you go back to the United States in the early days of enforcement of arbitral awards, it's a fascinating read for some of the judges who didn't really understand the limitations of their review power and the like. I know we're coming down, believe it or not, it's been very quick to the last 8 minutes, but I would like to go back to an area that we talked about a few minutes ago, and that is political stability in the region, because we had a question come in after your observation about China. We have seen recent agreement between Iran and China, and possible instability based on that. Of course, we have the situation with Yemen and Saudi Arabia as well. What are your thoughts in terms of stability?
Well, as I said earlier, China is interested in stability in the region, and I don't think an agreement with Iran is necessarily destabilizing to the region. But China has an enormous appetite for oil right now and oil products. They are certainly Saudi Arabia's largest customer. They have been buying on the black market much of Iran's oil, and in some ways keeping their economy from completely imploding. And so I think the game for China is to have multiple sources of oil from as many partners as they can muster. But the Saudis are certainly well aware that if they faced an existential threat, the last great power that would come to their aid would be China. And so there's going to continue to be a relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, the Western world, and likewise the other Gulf monarchies. A theory is out there that there is an increasing likelihood of a military conflict over Taiwan between China and the United States. If that were to happen, short of launching a nuclear exchange, what would the United States do? Well, one thing they might do would be to go to the Saudis and say, all right, we need you to embargo any shipments of oil to China. What would China's fallback be? Iran. And so in some ways, they are hedging their bets on maintaining a supply of oil. They are also serving as a counter in some ways from an economic competition standpoint with the United States in the region. But I don't see that as inherently destabilizing governments so much as protecting their supply chains for important products.
Well, it's interesting how it is the economics that are dictating so much of this from the perspective of China and the like. A couple of other questions have come in, and one getting back to instability in the region and the role of sanctions that have been used, particularly, in the situation with Syria and Iraq and the like. What is your thought about this? And one of the observers has said that this has caused a deterioration in the rule of law. I'm just curious about your thoughts.
I think the notion of sanctions certainly seems to be used with a heavy hand these days. And the notion of secondary sanctions is something that makes it very hard for otherwise law-abiding governments to tolerate. So, for example, when we're talking about the Nord Stream 2 gas project between Russia and Germany, imposing secondary sanctions on countries that do business with the Russians regarding Nord Stream 2 is a harsh way of dealing with states that are otherwise allies. And it may also be a failing policy because that project is, 90% complete. So that's just an example. Certainly in Syria as well, I think we're seeing sanctions being used in the absence of any other kind of policy. But they're only bad choices in Syria. And so that is one of the conundrums that we face in dealing with it. Certainly the idea of regime change has long passed. And there is simply now I think an attempt to manage the situation as opposed to solving it. And when you can't figure out something, it seems that the governments always have the fallback position of wanting to pursue sanctions.
Great. And then the final question, and there are other questions that have come in that I apologize, we're just not going to be able to get to. But the final one is something that I think I'm sure have given some thought to, given the fact that you lived in Dubai and you're familiar with the leadership there. And it deals with the Abraham Accords. And whether you think, are we going to see an expansion along these lines throughout the region over the next 2 to 3 years? And what was your reaction to the Accords and this historic agreement involving the Emirates, United States, and Israel?
I think it's one of the most positive things that has come out of the Middle East in quite some time. But I also think it is a long way from being a complete game changer. It may be the beginning of game-changing conduct, but it's certainly not the end of the road. I'm told that Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi was the architect of much of this. And I think it's very encouraging. And it also, frankly, it recognizes a reality on the ground that has existed for quite some time, which is that Israel is doing business with many countries in the Middle East, even those that have not yet joined the Abraham Accords. So, for example, Saudi Arabia continues to hold out, partly because they are the custodians of the two holy mosques. They represent Sunni Islam, and they have always had a tremendous allegiance to the plight of the Palestinians. And so King Salman, certainly, as long as he's alive, is not likely to sign on to the Abraham Accords unless there is some sort of two-state solution for the Palestinians. After he's gone, what MBS does, we don't know. But the reality is, from a business standpoint, the Israelis are doing business all over the place. And amazingly, just this past, I think, October, 130,000 Israelis had visited Dubai. This is unheard of. And likewise, you will see a lot of Arabs visiting Israeli sites at some point. This is the kind of not simply government to government, but people to people movement that can actually make a difference. And so when you talk about the rule of law, these kinds of things also are intertwined with that. And it's a tremendous opportunity for people across borders to get to know each other, to realize that they have much more in common than they have differences. And yet at the same time, the reality is they also have a common perceived enemy in Iran. And so from a political standpoint, that also gives them something to gather around.
Wow. Well, with that, Ambassador Jordan, I'd like to thank you so much for covering a wide range of issues related to the region, always bringing back front and center the issue of the rule of law. In your last answer in particular, I was thinking of in terms of people coming together, perhaps the lawyers are doing just that, whether it be the universities or bar associations and the like, understanding that working together and helping build something is of greater value for the livelihood of everyone than having severe disagreements, which ultimately could, lead to violence and the like. But you did great justice to Dean Robert Storey and the vision that SWIICL had in putting this event together. So I would like to thank you again, Bob, for these wonderful remarks. I'd also like to thank the audience for the questions. Highly engaged audience, and I know that after you log off, you'll be thinking a great deal of what you heard today. If I could just give you a little announcement that our next Storey lecture will be in May, and it will feature Hawa Ibrahim, who is a Nigerian human rights lawyer, and we'll be focusing on human rights and rule of law issues in Africa. And so with that, we'll be signing off. Everybody have a great rest of the day and stay safe. And thank you again, Ambassador Jordan.
Thank you, and thanks to the audience.
Bye-bye.